50 people had registered.
Wow.
That's nice. That's nice.
Like it's just like pouring in this afternoon, and
I mean,
but
more
there's
people.
there's a limit on 350, I think.
Okay, it's recording and it's, I think, going Facebook Live. Okay, I'm going live on Facebook, so you can start in about 25 seconds.
Okay.
Let you know when to go live once it is on Facebook. Okay, I would request everyone to mute their, yeah, we have Facebook Live. Please mute your sound. Yeah. You're good to go, Suprabha.
Okay. A warm welcome to everyone through this remarkably unwild medium, which, you know, I'm pretty certain if we breathe enough into it, it might sprout some tendrils and fungal filaments or spider silk, and some ants might walk onto our keyboards and wave their antennae at us, and, you know, a gecko might yap from the ceiling every time he or she disagrees. So that's by way of, you know, honoring the wild ones about whom this meeting is about. I'm very pleased to invite Pradip Krishen, the author of Trees of Delhi and Jungle Trees of Central India, and also creator of Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park, and a number of other interesting projects in the Lower Himalaya and Nagaur. And Govinda Bowley, who has been core to the creation of Arunagiri Park and the rewilding of Arunachala Mountain. He's also a member of the Marudam Farm School to tell us some interesting stories. I'm Suprabha Seshan from Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary, and I'm moderating this session along with Leo Saldana of Environment Support Group. And the hosts for this session are actually the Center for Financial Accountability. So by way of introduction, I just want to say a couple of things before giving, you know, the floor over to Pradip and Govinda. I've been really keen to bring together these two wonderful people, both very good friends of mine, in an online event, because they have a fantastic range of practical stories up their sleeves. They have lots of information as well as insight into the biomes that they love and have chosen to work with. For anyone wanting to start their own rewilding mission, or anyone who has tricky problems they need help with, here are two persons to connect with. I believe also that Govinda and Pradip are both part of a really interesting cultural shift. Both of them, and also all of us at Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary and our network of rewilding connections across India, consisting of tribal, rural, urban people, young people, old people, all kinds of people, have had the great fortune to be able to do what we do, which is basically to care for a little patch of earth that has been harmed in one way or another to lesser or greater degrees, from what could be considered, you know, analogous to sunburn or fire burn, from first degree to third or fourth degrees, where most of the living regenerative tissue is destroyed, but not all. I'm hoping that a couple of outcomes of this discussion is that anyone interested is going to walk away with some pointers to rewild, but also with some questions on their own motivations and what truly inspires them. I suppose for myself, really, the key underlying question for today is, can nature be nurtured to conditions of health from conditions of devastation, given the larger global predicament of extraction and hubris? But what does it mean to say yes to the wild, to nature? Because when we say yes to nature, first, we're actually saying yes to experiencing the wild, and also to working and playing and exploring questions in and with the wild. Over the years, Pradip and Govinda and I and lots of others have probably met tens of thousands of people who are interested in doing something for the natural world, including human beings. So they come, say, for instance, to the Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary, or they write or call There's a lot of back and forth, exploring various things. And almost inevitably, I am driven to ask them, what do you really want for the natural world? People say all these sweet sounding things. I want the planet to be better, or the land to be better, or to reconnect children to the forest, or have butterflies and birds back. They'll even say they want community to prosper. But what does this truly mean, both for the land and for themselves? And of course, the real question is, what does this look like for the land? What is actually going to be done or not done? We also have to ask the question, what it looks like for the person. How does it change their life? There are consequences, time, resources, dedication, purpose, and a certain rewilding of ourselves even. And there are challenges we face with the destruction at large to create something that is good for a small part of the natural world, and also for us as individuals involved, and also for the communities we identify with, or who identify with that part of the world, or who need it anyway. So something like a reintegration of imagination into the land is involved. And as some indigenous people might say, of even being dreamt into being by the land to do what it is they're doing. So a question to keep at the back of the mind for people attending the session, and you'll all be welcome to raise questions or comments later on, is what will rewilding look like for you, for that patch of land or community that you are part of, assuming you and others are empowered to rewild. So Pradip, Govinda, I'd like to begin this session with that moment or that phase when each of you was inspired to take the course of actions you did to rewild those two places in those two biomes. I'd like a kind of a description of what happened. And, you know, if we were to turn back the clock to that day, has your image or sense of rewilding changed? So can you give us a sense of how things have moved for you, what you conceived of then, felt to be possible, and what you conceive of now from what you know is possible after 10, 20 years? You know, would you say something different now? In other words, why did you start doing what you are doing, and why do you continue? Over to you.
You could start, Govinda. You want to go first?
Wow. Wow. What to do other than just dive into that beautiful, generous, multifaceted. What else would we expect from you, Supi? So much there in what you pointed at, and all I could say in there was something that you said, and yeah, without wanting to get hubristic oneself, the dreaming into, when you said to get dreamt into being, and what was imagined when one dived into starting. As you said, it's been a very practical journey. It's been a very muddy journey. It's been a journey in the soil, but it's also been this sense from the beginning that, there were other forces at play, without wanting to get too esoteric. There has always been this sense that, there were things that wanted to happen, and we were along for the ride. Yeah, it's hard to. I don't want to dive too much into that, but that somehow was always the sense. There wasn't a plan. There wasn't a grand idea of what it would become, or a practical understanding of what we were doing. There was an impulse and a willingness to be responsive to what the land seemed to be telling us from the beginning. And of course, then the understanding in the beginning was embarrassingly non-existent and remains embarrassingly small, in terms of, completely untrained and remain an absolute amateur. But there's been a principle of somehow engaging with what we can decipher that the land is telling, and responding to our engagement. And with that, maybe I'll see what Pradip has to say about his experience, and then maybe look at the landscapes themselves.
Yeah. So before I actually start talking about Jodha Park, let me just say, that I went through a period when I'd given up making cinema and didn't quite know what to do with the rest of my life, and called it my midlife crisis, and fondly expected sympathy and love. But I went to live in a wild little place in the south of Madhya Pradesh, and completely fell in love with the jungle. And I think when I look back, I realized that I've always had a very, I've always loved wilderness, even if I wasn't consciously aware of it, even as a child. So roughly around 1998, I started, having tried to do some ecological planning in Pachmari in southern Madhya Pradesh. And having tried to work with government and having failed to do so, I had to come to terms with the fact that I needed to do something again. And I said, maybe I should write a little book about some of the trees that I've learned about. And I thought, I looked outside my gate in Delhi and I said, gosh, I've got a tree here that I've lived with all my life and I don't know what it is. And I thought, why don't I write a little 25-page book or a 30-page book about Delhi's most common trees, and if necessary, I'll print it myself or Satchel style it or whatever. And that, as it went on and on, it became a bigger book, and that's how I got into trees, really. So roughly 1998, and then about 2 or 3 years later, some friends who owned a lodge in the lower Himalaya in the northwest said, can you help us to plant some trees? You go on prattling about trees and telling us about. And I said, look, why don't you do the obvious thing? Why don't you plant trees that are native to your habitat, to your landscape? And they said, why should we do that? I mean, shouldn't we have flowering trees and ornamental trees? And I said, yeah, but if you plant right, if you plant things that are truly adapted to your soil and your climate and your moisture regime, you will get an entire landscape that requires no looking after. So they went away and they were carrying a list that I'd given them for their area, and they came back and they said, we can't find any of this in any of the nurseries. We found 2 trees out of about 40. So you better come to us and tell us how we need to do this. And basically, I was advocating that they should pick up things from the forest floor, that they should make vegetative cuttings and things like that. And I spent 1.5 years helping them do this, and it was such an amazing experience. And we had such incredible success because it was poor soil, but it was very high rainfall. And we had the most immediate results. So all I really knew about rewilding was this very brief experience of 1.5 years of helping some friends, grow local things in the lower Himalaya. When I met by accident, I was called into a meeting because some people from Rajasthan were visiting, and they said, we are trying to grow a forest in the outer moat of sand in Nagaur Fort, which is about 120 kilometers northeast of Jodhpur. And can you help us? And I said, look, I don't know anything about the desert. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know its plants. But if you're willing to take a risk, I'm happy to go there and advise you to basically plant local things. And that's what happened. So I've spent a year planting in Nagaur. Again, it did extremely well very quickly. And that's really how I got invited into Mehrangarh Fort. And that's how the Jodha Park started. So I talk about that when we start talking about our respective karma bhumis, if you like. But there's one thing I want to stress, that like Govinda said, there wasn't a lot of knowledge, certainly not technical knowledge about soils or minerals or ecology. We had unbounded faith in the idea that doing local, planting local things would work somehow, and it did work, and that's really what energized the entire process.
So my sense is that you took lots of little baby steps, and not, bring in the earth movers and let's like transport trees from somewhere else and bung them into the ground, not that kind of an approach, but fairly low key and feeling your way through both species and habitats and so on. I thought before we get into the specifics of the biome that both of you are involved in, and I was thinking, one of the key principles of rewilding is to let nature lead, and also working at enough of a scale that nature is driving the changes. And one can argue that nature is always driving the changes, because if we fail to respect nature's laws or limits, then the consequence is there's a pretty profound consequence. So can we explore just the terms rewilding and restoration, what they mean to us? Because it's now become part of the lexicon. We ourselves have grown in how we refer to some of the things that we do. So is there something that, can we just, for the sake of the group that's participating today, just say what this means? What does rewilding mean? What does restoration mean to us? Is there a difference between the two?
Rewilding, as I understand it, is actually a term that was invented in England for very, very large landscapes, millions of hectares, So there's a bit of arrogance, I think, in our borrowing that term and applying it to what are essentially very, very small landscapes. But I find it a very nice term, because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand, at least in my case, what the land might have been like before it was interfered with, before it was ruined in some sense, and I'm always working in landscapes that are in some sense ruined. They're either planted up with invasive plants. So, the idea that nature always rules or nature always drives is not, to my mind, always true. You'll see when I show you some pictures of the landscape in Jodhpur, that it was a completely ruined landscape. It was a landscape that was difficult to begin with. It was extremely rocky, very little soil. And then it had an invasive Mexican and South American plant that actually inhibits anything else from growing close to it. So if we just allowed that to continue, it would have been a pure monoculture of Prosopis juliflora. And that's what nature would have done. So I think there are situations where you do need to intervene to try and help nature to limp back, to restart the whole process of building up biodiversity. Now, one of the key questions, I think, and I'm sure Govinda will want to talk about this some more, is, we sometimes, I think, tend to arrogate to ourselves the idea that we can create a climax by going, straight to it without going through the steps that nature leads, a biome through. And that never really happened. So that's something that I think we have to be careful about, and people need to be careful about when they dream of, or they imagine, or they commission work that leads to rewilding. Do you want to say something about that, Govinda?
Well, I'll let you finish. And I think for me, the easiest way to maybe approach this then is to introduce our landscape here, and
Okay.
and start to talk about how those questions have played out in our experience. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to go there? Do you want to tell us something about the landscape there? We can approach this abstract question in a much more practical way.
Sure.
Okay. Shall I begin? Okay, I'm going to need to share my screen and show you some pictures, because it will make it much more graphic and visual. Okay, this is Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur. For those of you who don't know where Jodhpur is, that little star on the map at the bottom shows you that it's sort of in the center of the state of Rajasthan. It's a little bit to the west of the Aravallis, so it's very much in the more deserty part of Rajasthan. And this is the wonderful, iconic fort that sits on top of a hill that is made up entirely of volcanic rock. And it basically, the hill falls away to the city on three sides, and then on the other side is oops, why is it not easier? Here we are. So this is what rhyolite looks like. Now, essentially, rhyolite is magma that has been blown out of the caldera of a volcano and solidified into these flat-faced, normally hexagonal, very large, rocks. And even in this See India poster that you see, which dates back to the 1940s, this was very much the sort of iconic view of Jodhpur, that it was dominated by this very particular kind of rock, which is even harder than granite. It's an extremely difficult rock to work with, right? And how am I not able to move this? Okay, here we are. So this is basically what the area of the proposed park looked like when I first got there in 2005. When a gentleman who was in charge, he was the CEO of the trust that ran the fort. The fort is a magnificent museum. And he said, he said to me, Pradip, would you be prepared to green this area for us? And I must have gulped a few times, because it's a magnificent place with a magnificent view, but it's also a very frightening place because of the fact that it was so rocky, so devoid of soil except at the bottoms of these little rills and valleys. And also it was completely dominated by precipice, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, one of the things you need to do when you're shown a landscape is to try and see whether you have any sort of clues about what it might have been like before it was ruined. And these are two watercolors by an English painter called, sorry, I forget his name, from the 1890s. And he'd drawn some vegetation. If you look at the picture at the bottom, and you can see these candelabra-shaped euphorbia. You can see some of the milkweeds, the calotropis, but they tend to be generic plants. They're not really specific plants. So there were very few clues about what actually grew in this area. And we realized that we would actually have to go out into the desert to try and see what we could find. But what I said to the CEO was, I said, look, you need to tell me what you have in your mind's eye when you talk about greening this area. Because if you think it's going to be like a municipal park with extensive lawns and, you know, flowering trees, you also need to ask yourself whether you are, first of all, prepared to bring in several million tons of soil, because there is no soil here, and also whether you are willing to water and tend and provide nutrients to all these plants every single day for the rest of your lives, because you are in a desert. And he scratched his chin and said, well, when you put it that way, then it doesn't sound like such a good idea, so should we just leave it as it is? And I said, no, that's not the only alternative. The alternative is to try and make an attempt to restore the natural ecology of a rocky desert. And he said, what would that mean? What would the implications of that be? And I said, well, it would mean, first of all, getting rid of the Prosopis juliflora, because it's invasive, it doesn't allow other plants to grow, it secretes an alkaloid in its root zone that inhibits the growth of other plants, it's unsightly. And I discovered in the course of time that basically what had happened was that sometime in the 1930s, Maharaja Umed Singh had been told by somebody that if he wanted to green his desert kingdom, there was this magical tree that is found in Mexico and in South America called Prosopis juliflora, which doesn't seem to require much water, will grow in rock, will grow in alkaline soils, will grow in all kinds of places, doesn't need nutrients. And he ordered hundreds of bags full of seeds of Prosopis juliflora. And he was an aviator, he used to fly his own airplane, and he broadcast the seeds of Prosopis throughout the kingdom of Jodhpur, which was a lot bigger than the state, than the district of Jodhpur is today. It extended all the way to the Gujarat boundary, border. So this particular area, which consisted of something like 70 hectares, these two pictures show you what it was like before the broadcasting happened. And 2005, the picture shows you what it was like when I first saw it. So Prosopis juliflora was everywhere. It was an unbelievable, thickets of taller Prosopis in the valleys where there was a little bit of moisture and soil, but also going up the hillsides in almost sheer rock. This tree had found a way to grow in particular places. So it was an extremely daunting prospect to try and plant here. And you have to remember that, I didn't have the experience. I didn't know my desert plants. So, in a sense, one is really starting from scratch. This slightly closer, it gives you a sense of what Prosopis was like when we started, right? The first thing we obviously had to try and do was to see what did we need to do, how would we get rid of Prosopis. If you Google Prosopis juliflora, you discover quite quickly that it has a budding zone that goes down about 3 feet, which means that unless you go down 3 feet, if you cut it anywhere before that, it will simply resprout, it will stop it and come back, possibly with redoubled vigor, right? So the issue was, how do we cut into this extremely recalcitrant, tough rock in such a way that it doesn't become a huge problem? And people gave us all kinds of ideas. And people said, on a full moon night, you just cut it and put some fresh cow dung on top of it and it won't resprout. And we laughed, but we said, let's try it anyway. Of course, it didn't work. Somebody said, try dynamite. And we said, what? And they said, no, we don't mean a big charge of dynamite. We mean maybe 1/100th of the normal charge that we use. And we said, show us. And they tried to blow up one little 4-foot-high bush for precipice, but it actually blew the top off a little, rocky hill. And we said, no, this is not going to work. And then somebody said to us, and there were several other ideas. I'm getting some disturbance.
यहीं पे खाने के बाद देख लेना थोड़ी देर थोड़ा चन्ना लिया जाके तेरा ये रहा देख बिना मिर्ची का
somebody's mic needs to be turned off. Yeah. Finally, after several attempts, somebody said to us, why don't you try and work with the traditional miners of this part of Rajasthan who are called Khanwalias? And I was skeptical because the Khanwalias use, they work normally with sandstone, which is the universal building material in Jodhpur. It's cheap, it's everywhere, and it's a very obedient rock. Whereas Rhyolite is the opposite. It's a very difficult rock to work with. It doesn't cut in ways that you can predict. And we said, look, these guys probably don't have any experience of work. And they said, no, they do. So we called in Dan Singh, who is the man at the bottom right, who is the leader of one of the little communities of Khanwalias. We took him to a small, 4 or 5 foot high precipice bush, and we said, can you show us that you can cut in to a depth of at least 3 feet? And he was completely confident. He said, sure, no problem. And he went down on his knees, and basically they use extremely heavy hammers, and they use chisels. And he tapped the ground a few times, and then he turned his face away, and he hit the ground hard without using the chisel, just with his hammer. And I assumed, as anyone would assume, that he was turning his face away because he didn't want shards of rock to go into his eyes. But we realized later that actually what he was doing was he was listening to the sound that his hammer made on the rock. And from the sound, he could divine the character of what the rock was like underneath, how it was interbedded, where there might be cracks, and all the information that he needed in order to start cutting in, he derived just from those 3 hammer blows. So we realized very soon that these guys were just brilliant. They were a tough crew, but they really knew their marbles, and that this was the only sustainable, non-toxic way of actually being able to start cutting into the rock. And eventually, to run ahead of my story, they actually stayed with us for 7 years, working 12 months in every year, basically going plot by plot and tree by tree and removing every single precipice, bush or tree that they actually found. That's the Khanwalia story. I just want to give you a sense of what the terrain was like. These are precipice bushes high up on a hill where there's very little soil. These are the kinds of trenches that they made. They weren't usually making trenches. They were usually making just pits. But sometimes when they found basically a weakness, a fault in the rock, they would give us more opportunities to plant in like that. And we made the decision, partly by accident, but it proved to be one of the most interesting, the most clever things that we thought of. We said that, look, precipice has shown us where it's possible to grow in this very, very difficult stony habitat. And what we're going to do is we're going to use precipice to decide where we will plant. So wherever precipice came out, it became an opportunity to plant something new. And that's basically what we did. These pictures show you how they're working in this very, very stony land. But it's a very, very difficult habitat, right? I just got a series of 4 or 5 pictures to show you how there's one particular area where we hoped that we would eventually have the first walkway that would lead people into the park. And this is what a particular kind of tekra or a little rocky hill looked like when we began. This is them actually prizing apart some of the rocks to create cracks. and little opportunities for grasses and things to grow. This is what it looked like roughly 7 or 8 months later, just after the rain started. And this is what it looked like 2 years later when things had started to grow inside it. So this, I'm going to stop here for now, but this just gives you a sense of what we were up against, right? Over to you, Govinda.
Beautiful. I knew that I was up against the pros with the with the presentations and all. So I've just got a couple. I thought just to introduce first of all our landscape itself. So I should also start screen sharing, I suppose. Is it? Yeah. Has that come?
Yep.
Yeah.
But,
so it's very interesting because both of us.
Share your screen. Why don't you go to the top of your thing and share your screen? I mean, you shared your screen, but in your slide program, make sure it's full screen.
Just a second.
no, if you go to the bottom, Govinda, there'll be a little icon that you can press to make it full screen. Just go below.
Just.
Or if you make the whole thing small. Okay, let's just go with this.
We'll just go with that for now. No,
Yeah.
So the interesting thing, listening to you, which actually hadn't occurred to me, is the similarity in that both of us find ourselves on a hill on the edge of the town. Talking about rewilding, and as you were saying about this term being coined for huge landscapes, it was always evident in our situation that we are not in this infinite landscape. We're in this actually clearly defined mountain, which is rising out of an agricultural plain on the edge of a fast-growing, in the Indian context, medium-sized town. So this is an image of the hill. Here, this is the extent of the town here, and the outer circumference of this hill is about 14 kilometers. So it's a couple of thousand acres or more of forest landscape. It's largely under the forest department, areas of revenue department. So we're in northern Tamilnadu. We're in the plains, which I kind of always describe as flat with bumps on them. So we have this, we have this agricultural landscape, which is really it's not rolling. It's very much a plain, and then you have these what are called inselbergs, which are very old, mostly charnockite rock, which is the same rock, which makes up a lot of peninsular India. And these are the remaining hillocks, where the surrounding landscape, the softer rock has weathered down, and these are the remaining standing hills. We're about 30 kilometers from the eastern Ghats as the crow flies, and we're about 100 kilometers from the coast. So just to put that in a kind of landscape context, this is our hill here, and nearby forest areas, these are the eastern Ghats here. This is a forest area with a dam to our west. And these were the places that we could turn to kind of have some sense of what our hill might have looked like. This is what our hill looked like in the 50s, 60s, 70s. As you can see, pretty bare. I shy away from barren. I shy away from the term destroyed because actually I don't really know what was there before we got involved, but this is the same aspect recently. So this is, again, kind of on the slopes of the hill in recent years. So I'll go back to chatting because where do I turn off that screen? So.
Start video.
Sorry? So
You want to turn off your screen there, Govinda, if you want to chat.
So now there had been efforts to, as I say, this is actually, the ownership of this hill is quite different. It's under the Forest Department, and they had had plantings in the 70s, and other community groups had also through the 80s been working on reforesting this hill. But when we got involved in the early 2000s, the situation was so in our situation, sorry, I'm confused. We had a situation where the hill was burnt every year. So we didn't have a problem with invasives to the extent that Pradip was talking about. We had a biome which was being artificially kept in a state of degradation, largely through fire. So we had a type of lemongrass which predominated on the hill. And essentially every summer this would be burnt off, and after having been cut for thatch. So that it was a time when there was still a lot of thatched houses around, and this was a part of the local economy that people would cut this grass for thatch, and after that was done, they would burn it off to make it easier for the next year's crop to be cut and to bring a new flush of growth, and also perhaps for some grazing and the like. So, but actually at the time that we started to work as a local economy, that had shifted. People were no longer building thatched houses. But over decades, perhaps centuries, the fact that it had been burnt every year had essentially created something close to a monoculture of this fire-loving grass, which would spread the fire easily. And there were little pockets of forest in the gullies and places that were surrounded by rocks and protected from fire. There was rootstock of things trees that could take a fire, but they would burn down and resprout in the following year. And very much like you, Pradip, the first step was to look around our landscape and find where's the nearest patches of forest and just start looking what's growing there. Start thinking, visioning what could this place have looked like. Didn't have British watercolors. In our case, we had 5th, 6th century poems of describing cavorting elephants and running streams and this kind of thing happening on the hill. And we had accounts of leopards here up until the 40s. But we were able to go to forests really quite nearby and see that, similar, rocky slopes, similar thin soils, similar hot, brutal summers that, people looked at our hill and said, it's not possible for anything to grow there. It's so hot, it's so dry, the soil. But we would go to nearby into the Eastern Ghats and say, okay, it's no cooler, it's no more deep soils, and it's a forest here. So that was what informed what the place could look like, and the best piece of advice that somebody gave in the very early days was start your nursery. Start your nursery, and that's the heart of what you do. So that's what we did. We started looking wherever we found pockets of local vegetation, and we got to know the forest by going to the forest, and we got to know the plants by collecting their seeds and starting to sprout them, and from 2003 we have been planting on the slopes of that hill, somewhere around averaging over 15,000 plants every year. Now we have focused, because we're heading towards a forest ecosystem rather than a desert one. We have focused on woody things in the faith that kind of large architecture will create the space for the other smaller plants to follow. So we went about planting first year, and then first summer came and first fire came, and we were out. The local forest officer went to the college and he rounded up a bunch of students, and all of our staff were on the hill till 2 in the morning. The fire raged through the night. We got back to it at 6 in the morning, and it went out by 10 the next day, and the whole valley that we had planted that year was burnt. So immediately very clear, okay, this is priority. And so we started to, from that year onwards, we started to cut fire breaks. I'll show you pictures of all of that in time, and work with changing the culture that this was a given, that the hill just burns every year. Looking at why that was, that, you know, what were the causes of that, and then seeing what happened. And immediately what happened when we were able to bring down the instance of fire was that our planting, even though it increased year on year, and our capacity in our nursery, the diversity of our nursery kept growing, and the number of, you know, our knowledge of the forest was growing. What was actually happening was that whatever we did was dwarfed by what was happening on its own. So this riot just immediately started to happen of the forest coming back by itself. And those photos of this bare hillside were kind of deceptive, because there was all these things popping up that we hadn't planted. And so it's quite a different experience in that way, that most of what happened was not through our planting, was through identifying what was stopping the forest actually and the land expressing itself. We didn't have a huge invasive situation like you had. But we were chatting the other day about also that doing less, or, you know, the impulse when one moves into a landscape to really make a mark, and you had been speaking about the water conservation, and how a lot of people have the immediate impulse to, you know, build bunds, build check dams, build you know, trenches and all of that. And we certainly shared an experience on that front, which, you know, perhaps you could tell your side, and then I'll chime in with how it worked out for us.
Okay, well, first let me just give you a sense of how we learned what we needed to plant. you know, there's an excellent book called The Flora of the Desert, written by a man called M.M. Bhandari. He was our authority, in a sense, for the panoply of plants, the flora of the desert, right? But what tends to happen with floras, not just there, but I think everywhere in this country, is that these are floras that are arranged by the order in which botanists think that plants have evolved. They're phylogenetic lists, right, organized by family. And there's very little by way of ecology, very little by way of what the plants actually need in terms of the soil, the minerals, the substrate, the water regime, all of that. And essentially what we were doing was we were going out into the desert, we were looking for rocky substrate. So basically the whole of Marwa, the whole of the Western desert was actually a volcanic province 750 million years ago. And then it had been, the whole of the volcanic province had become a sea when India floated up and docked with you know, the Eurasian continent. And so you had sandstone that covered the rhyolite, the volcanic rock. But in places, the volcanic rock outcrops. So we're really looking at tiny little outcrops here and there, not quite inselbergs like yours, but, you know, and not necessarily tall. But these became our window to the kinds of plants, the kind of what are called lithophytes. Lithophytes are plants that live in rock, that are adapted to living in rocky situations. And there's a big binary between plants that are adapted to living in sand and plants that live in rock, because plants that live in sand tend to invest all their energy into pushing their roots deep down into the sand, because sand offers so little resistance, right, to roots. So they can do it. And sand is self-mulching. So if you go down, you know, even 2 feet, you can actually get levels of moisture, but this is not true of rock at all. So in rock, you will tend to get, some succulents, some trees like prosopis that have very deep roots. But by far the most effective technique for a plant that grows in these rocky places is to be ephemeral, to live for a very short time, to germinate with the first rains and rush through the life cycle, and be gone by the time, you know, October or November or December comes along, and then to remain dormant as a seed hiding inside a, you know, hard coat, waiting for the next rain. And so we were bringing in plants, we were learning how to grow these seeds. We had some failures. We learned by trial and error how to grow them. And we found that we were getting something like 65, 70% survival rates with the plants that we were putting into the ground. We were using these pits that had been vacated by the prosopis. And we didn't quite understand why we were getting, you know, rates as low as 65 or 70%. Why not 100%? And we decided then that we didn't really know enough about the micro niches that plants actually occupy within a habitat. And this brings me to the point you made, Govinda, about water. When we started, this was our first impulse, you know, basically somehow harvest water. If water is running down a slope, punctuate the slope with little bits of gully plugging so that, you know, the water then slowly infiltrates into the rock. But it's a very expensive business. It's a very time-consuming and laborious business. And the more we explored out into the desert, the more we realized that, you know, there are plants adapted to every single part of a habitat. So you don't necessarily need to make these swales and, you know, to harvest water, as long as you can understand what it is that plants needed. So what we actually did was we decided to keep very rigorous notes about every single pit, what its depth was, what species was planted within it. We were trying different kinds of, potting mixtures, soil mixtures. We were using mycorrhizal propagules in some and not in others. We described the site quality, and we went around every 6 months and we started noting how these plants were faring in the landscape. And it took something like 2 or 2.5 years. But at the end of 2.5 years, if you used an Excel sheet and you put all the species together, more often than not, you started to see patterns. You started to see that, oh, okay, so if you plant Bordy and it doesn't have a pit that is at least 4 foot deep, and if it doesn't have a greater amount of clay in the soil mixture, it's not going to do well. And that began to inform the way we planted. And this was huge because our ultimate aim was to create a sustainable landscape. I can say with full confidence today that we don't water anything. It's a desert, it's rocky. If we see a plant dying for want of water, we say, let it die. It's the wrong plant in the wrong place. It needs to be replaced with something that's going to manage here. But unless we could do this, it would have been a huge failure, right? But I think this water thing is very, very important because, you scratch a landscape architect today, the first thing they're taught is make a swale. Swale is this magical word that comes out of their mouths, But really, you need to understand how plants adapt to different micro niches within a habitat. And that's crucial, right? Over to you, Govinda. Or Suprabha. Well.
No, I mean our experience with the water was, we have a much larger hill than yours. It's over 800 meters, and that's rising from a plain of 200 meters high. So it's it's more than 600 meters, from bottom to top. Steep slopes and large catchments. Some of those catchments are hundreds of acres that run into a single gully. And so, as I said, we had a situation where every summer, whatever vegetation was there was getting burnt off. And then you have the monsoon arriving or the pre-monsoon arriving, and the first showers land on a soil which is completely exposed. And so the place where we have our nursery and then we have a kind of public interface is the base of one of these catchments and has a stream which flows through it during the monsoon. And first year of our work, we made some ponds to create some habitats, and we put a little check dam in that we could divert this stream to fill these ponds. And the first big rain, this stream came gushing down, and the backup pond from our check dam was filled with sand in the first rain. So we emptied out that sand. We had to, and next big rain, similar thing. What we found within the first year, so, as soon as we had stopped, somebody's got a mic on.
Somebody needs to switch off.
So we're not talking about, the return of lush forests and canopies covering the hillside and all these trees. Simply whatever ground cover was allowed to not be burnt off or graze down to dust within the first couple of years. We went from a situation where one big heavy rain, let's say, a 5 centimeter summer thunderstorm, would send this gushing stream down full of sediment and soil which is being washed off, the precious soil kind of coming down off the slopes, to a situation where it could rain for 2 weeks before that stream would start to flow. And we're talking about a few hundred acres of hillside, channeled, steep slopes channeled into one stream. And the flip side of it being able to rain for a long time before the stream would start was that the stream would also flow after the rain had finished. And it would flow clean, and it was basically after that first year or two, we weren't getting any sand out of those ponds. Of course, the other thing that would happen if you put all that energy into check dams and swales, and if the soil was not protected, they don't last very long anyway, because they just fill up with the sediment which is being washed down, and then they're no longer trenches, they're just mini terraces on the hillside. So we were surprised by just how dramatic that capacity of the soil to soak up these rains was. It wasn't decades of forest growing. It was a couple of years of just allowing the ground cover to, the ground to be covered with plants. It was simple. It didn't need a huge forest. But that makes it possible for the forest to start coming, because now the soil is soaking up all this water, and it's staying there for longer, and it's feeding itself.
So
Right.
I think, you know what,
Pradip,
sorry.
just if I can,
Yeah.
we've come to about an hour, so we're roughly a third of the way. I was just wondering whether you want to move slowly into the actual plants that you have chosen and how you've
Right.
chosen them, and the whole process of bringing them from somewhere else, and then the nursery, and then planting them out.
Okay.
But talk about what you were going to do and see if you can just move into that.
No, I just, you know, I just want to emphasize the idea that this business about water is quite an important question, because obviously if you're planting at a panchayat level and you're involving people and you've got an agricultural component in what you're doing, then obviously it is important to harvest water, because most of your agricultural crops are going to demand water. But pure rewilding of a forest, I mean, I think the big difference between Govinda's situation and mine is that Govinda had rootstock that probably was hiding there under the soil, waiting for protection from fire, right? And the minute that protection was afforded to it, it could spring up. In our case, there wasn't any rootstock worth its name. But I want to talk to you about a couple of discoveries that I think were very, very interesting. If I can just share the screen again. Oops. Okay, am I on share?
Yeah.
I need to go back. Whoops. All right. What you're seeing on the screen now is a very interesting grass. This is probably about 6 inches high. The scale is not apparent. It's called Oropitium, and the common name is rock grass. And we discovered this grass almost by accident. I mean, it's not written about, it's not talked about, nobody tells you, anything about it. But we found that when we were traveling in the desert, rock grass has a wonderful relationship with the liverwort that you can see in the picture, in both the pictures actually. And like a lot of grasses, it's wind, the seeds are dispersed by the wind. So any little hollow, like the hollow that you see in the rock bottom right, tends to get filled with a bit of soil, and then the rock grass comes and colonizes it. And this is an absolutely crucial plant in the desert, because it once this combination of liverwort and rock grass comes into being, it prevents the soil from being washed away, and it allows the rock to grow a substrate on which other plants can grow. This sort of V-shaped soil that you can see in this little bit of rock this was made possible by Oropitium, which then allowed other grasses like Aristida here to grow on top of it. And sorry, why is it going backwards? Here we are. This is a picture of a small, tiny area of rock grass that has colonized. So it's obviously been in some bits it's been eroded either by flowing water or by the hooves of some animal. But this is what rock grass does. It slowly builds up layers of soil. In this case, you don't see the liverwort except as a kind of black substance, because liverwort is one of those resurrection plants that goes bright green the minute it rains, but when it's not raining, you can't really see it. It's a bit like a moth. And we discovered that for us, rock grass was going to be the magic bullet in some ways. So this is a picture that from the back of our visitor center, and it shows you a canal at the bottom right, which was built 500 years ago because it carries water by gravity from the western hills down to the base of the fort. And basically, it rains for about 2 or 3 weeks in Jodhpur, but all that water gets channeled to one particular lake. And without that lake filling with water, life would not have been possible in Mehrangarh Fort. And this is called Hati Neher, or it's also called the gully. So when you go into the gully, it looks like this. It's basically like a little rocky canyon that has been hewn by hand by ancestors of the Khandwalias 500 years ago, basically just to take water by gravity to that lake at the bottom. So what we decided to do, this shows you the gully from on top on the left, and this is where the gully opens out at the bottom. It opens out and you can see water flowing. So this is some part of the monsoon. What we decided to do was the first sort of public walk that we wanted to create inside the park was going to follow this canal, the gully, right? And we decided that we were going to try and spend more time and energy putting plants into these little rocky crevices, because, basically if you have an area even as small as 70 hectares, you can't work at it intensively all over. It's just too much work and too expensive. But you can do it in places where you know that visitors are going to be walking. So what we did here was we used Oropitium. We basically dug up little mats of it, typically 2 or 3 inches tall, and put it on horizontal rocky surfaces as places where other plants could then find, a footing. And this worked so beautifully. So in the course of 3 or 4 years, this is what the part of the hill above the gully looked like in the dry season. These are pictures about 3 years apart of how the gully basically got vegetated. And this is a picture in the rains 2 years ago. And the next picture shows you what the gully was like when we started. So this is what you can do if you begin to, read the landscape and get clues from it and learn from it and, and do the right thing. That's all I wanted to say about this particular aspect.
Yeah, completely amazing, Pradip. And water as a key constraining factor. I mean, obviously I'm coming from a place with 700 centimeters of rainfall, and the challenges that you have faced, but also how you have worked with it over time, and using both, in Govinda's case, the plant that just came back by preventing grazing and fire, and in your case, by actually finding out what could be some kind of a starter plant, starter complex of beings, actually.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
from the elemental to the bryophytic to the, you know, to the actually to the little grass. I think, you know, there's a number of questions which people are curious about the plants themselves, and both of you as gardeners and rewilders through nursery work, I think it would be great to hear something more about desert plants, the ones you chose, how you worked with them, and from Govinda, the forest plants from there. How did you actually go about choosing, and how many of which, and why would you give one priority over another? And can we get into that? The nitty-gritties of gardening?
So, shall I?
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. Like, I think both of your experience has been like really like the nitty gritties of gardening, like you say. And our experience has been sort of wider, let's say, bigger plants and wider, less refined, shall we say. Like I say, we have focused largely on woody species, so shrubs, trees, lianas of our area. You know, it was beautiful looking at those little pictures, Pradip, because we have these areas of sheetrock on our hill. We have, and in other nearby landscapes, you have these amazing kind of boulder landscapes in Tamilnadu. And you have these extraordinary little niches, and you have these, you know, masterpiece little natural gardens, sometimes in this tiny little hollow, you know, with I mean, they're just Zen masterpieces of natural pockets, you know, and the contrast with the rock, and then these little explosions of green in the rain that then disappear again. So, and we have these sheetrocks, but we haven't gone there. We have gone into the slopes of the hill that have soil and that would be forested, were they allowed to be. And so we are interestingly placed geographically, in that there's a very interesting forest type along the east coast, the southern eastern coast of the country, which is it's been called the Tropical Dry Evergreen forest type, which is it's unusual in its evergreen nature, given the amount of rainfall which we have on this coast. And I was very surprised to go to Mumbai one time and see the forests there with so much more rainfall and yet deciduous largely. And, you know, on this east coast, you have this thick, low evergreen forest. It's the trees do not get very high. It's kind of this dark, gnarly character, a lot of lianas. And that, as a forest type, extends about 60 kilometers inland. And then you go another 50 kilometers inland, and you hit the Eastern Ghats. And we're somewhere in between the two. And then also on the plains, you have this typical scrub forest patches, but whether they would actually have been scrub, or whether that's a result of degradation over centuries, also is an open question. So our approach has largely been, you know, if we find it growing in the forest and we're able to collect seeds and we can germinate them, we love everybody. We've not been super picky, but there have been cases where we know that things that are rare. There's one species which we have, which is Hildengardia, which is very limited range. It's a couple of little pockets down here in North Tamilnadu that this magnificent tree, and it's actually quite a lithophytic tree. It crops up on the edge of those sheetrock outcrops. And it's very interesting because often some of the things which seem to be the hardiest and the toughest are very difficult to germinate. Some things which are very rare and are struggling, we find very easy to grow, and that's not always clear why. But as I say, really our story has been so much about what has happened without us. Once the fire was stopped, what happened with the forest really saying yes, just taking off by itself, and the wildlife coming in by itself, the bird life returning by itself, and this planting that we've been sort of, it's been a contribution rather than this, than the actual major thing which has brought about the forest.
Pradip, do you want to take that on? Hello? Is he not there?
Can see him.
Is he on mute? Hi, Pradeep.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have a few pictures to show you some of the bigger plants that we use. There are something like 200 species that we use in all, including herbaceous things and grasses and everything else. But I'm just going to show you some pictures of the bigger things that we use because they're quite interesting in themselves. This is something called Acacia Senegal, which I'm sure you have in your area as well, Govinda.
Mm.
This is a landscape in the Alwar region. This is not really in our region, but this is one of the classic lithophytic trees. It loves rock. You sometimes see it in sand. Usually when you see it in sand, it's an indicator that there is rock not very far below that. It's something that is immensely hardy, flowers very beautifully, and we planted thousands of trees of kumat in our area. And some of the pictures that if we have opportunity, I can show you later. Just show you how beautifully it fills up some of these rocky valleys. Then there is this amazing succulent, which they call Thor in Rajasthan. This is a hill where you can see that up to a particular point, it's almost pure Thor. It's a euphorbia. It's what's called a cactoid euphorbia. Because
Pradeep, sorry, you haven't shared your screen.
Oh my God! Oh, sorry. I was wondering why. Oh, sorry. Share screen. Should I go back to the first one then?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can you see this now?
Mm-hmm.
No, I need to go back now. Okay. This is the first picture I started with, which is the kumat growing in the Alwar hills, right? This is what it looks like, but this is almost a pure forest of kumat on this particular hill, although it's slightly different on the hill further back on the right? And this is what kumat looks like up close. It's an acacia. It's distinguished from all other acacias by most other acacias in this region, certainly by having three thorns close to each other. Very hardy, very, very wonderful tree to have in this habitat. This is the This is the cactoid euphorbia that is called Thor. And you can see how it completely dominates the lower reaches of this particular hill, but not the top of the hill. And this is actually, we use the Thor as the logo for our park because we found that it's actually, it becomes a little microhabitat in itself. We've counted at least 24 plants that grow inside a Thor, partly because the Thor affords shade and cools and protection because of its spines from grazing animals. We found grasses that you only find inside a Thor, not because it won't grow anywhere else, but because they get grazed everywhere else. But the inside the Thor is the only place where the deer actually can't get to them. So this is a very, very important lithophite in our park, and we've had a great success with growing this. Then there's a tree that is called dhok, and dhok is not hugely important in our region, but it is hugely important all along the Aravalli, which is not very far from us. But very close to Jodhpur, in the hills, you get remnant patches of dhok. So we guessed that dhok, all of the stuff that you see along the middle, the bit that looks very cloudy and and fine, that's all dhok. Until you come to sheer rock, and then a little bit of euphorbia on top of that. And dhok is absolutely the most gorgeous tree, to my mind, in the whole of the dry deciduous forest zone of India. This is dhok, almost a pure dhok forest. The reason why it's almost pure is that it's a habitat specialist. It's the only tree that can actually survive on steep slopes that that are rocky, where water doesn't stay. And what's also amazing about dhok is that it forms clonal forest. So that means that very often what you see and what looks like several trees is actually one tree with one common root at base where you can't see the relationship, but it's one gigantic organism with the same DNA. And that's what.
Can I just interrupt you for a second, Pradip?
Yes.
No, I'm fascinated because this is what I was hoping that we would start learning as we were. So we have another Anogasus, the Anogasus latifolia.
Yeah. Latifolia, right.
And are you able to germinate the dhok?
Yes, we are.
So we have tremendous trouble germinating the Anogasus which we have. If you can collect seeds by the sackful, and you're lucky if you get.
It has a very low germination rate. Apparently, it's like 1%. But there are techniques, and we can talk about that later. I'll tell you what we've done and what other people like Vijay Dasmana have done, because they've also grown it, right?
Right.
And then you have another fascinating Anogasus, Govinda. This is not a rocky habitat. This is basically it's calcareous. You can see the nodules of calcium that you can see here. But all these trees are likely to be one giant organism. So this is another Anogasus. It's actually Anogasus sericea variety nummularia. I didn't have place to write the whole name. But this, to me, is one of the most beautiful desert trees. And you can only grow this if you actually give it its own kind of soil.
Sorry. Yeah, can we? No, can you? Leo, are you there?
Yeah, I'm trying to identify who's.
Yeah. We'll get there.
Somebody needs to switch off their mics, please. Right?
But Pradip, the other reason I was fascinated, because we have not on our hill, but on the nearest small range of hills to us, which is just less than 10 kilometers away, we have a pure stand of the Anogasus latifolia. And I had just intuitively felt that it was clonal. but I hadn't done any research on it, and I hadn't looked at it. So hearing you say that is wonderful.
It probably is. I think all the genera that I can think of Anagraecis are clonal, you know.
Ah.
Then you have Care, which is the classic, you know, desert tree that dispenses with leaves all together. It has just wiry green twigs. It has this amazing flush of orange flowers twice a year, and a fruit that is eaten as a vegetable in Rajasthan. So this is something that grows in sand as well, but it won't grow in dunes. It grows in what are called interdunes, where you get harder soil, you know, and less porosity in terms of the soil content, right? So these are the main plants we've used in what we've done. But if I can just go on for a bit, Govinda.
Please.
One of the things that we experienced was a kind of envy of plants that we saw in other soils, you know, other minerals that we didn't have inside our park. So we would sometimes look at these plants and say, gosh, wouldn't it be lovely to bring this plant back to our park? And we would try, and of course they wouldn't take because the soil wasn't quite right. So what we did was, at the back, what you're seeing here is the back of our visitor center where we had our parking lot. And we decided to create these raised beds. And what we did here was, essentially, we would go to our habitat and we'd collect the seed-bearing soil from the top few inches close to where the plant was growing, in the hope that there would be enough seeds in that soil. And then we would collect more of the soil and fill them into these cylinders, these little raised beds, and then put the seed-bearing soil on top, and then just wait for the rains. And we just had the most incredible results, you know. So this is just, for us, incredible to understand that if you give the plant the right minerals, the right soil, you know, it just becomes absolutely amazing. Just the plant you see in front of you here is a salsola, which was so rare that Dr. Bhandari said that I can't describe the flowers because I haven't seen them. But this thing began to grow like it was, you know, going out of style. So this became a very, very successful exhibit for us of other kinds of soils and therefore other kinds of plants that grow in the desert. Okay, over to you, Govinda.
Govinda.
Ask me a question.
Do you have anything to add, Govinda, to this point?
I'm being distracted with deliveries of cake. No, no, nothing to add at that moment.
There's lots of questions on, or some questions anyway, on how many species are you talking about? And, you know, I guess that would relate to, you know, what would be considered to be the number of species for the flora of your area. So, you know, what percentage are you working against? I think there's some people who are interested in that.
Certainly, we've been working with everything which we are able to collect seeds of and germinate, as I said, from, you know, from the woody species, which I think so far for us, trees and shrubs is over 150 different species of trees and shrubs that we've been able to grow in any reasonable number and get planted out.
And the hill would have many more, right? So
it would have more. There would be, but there would also be things which we have brought back, which had disappeared from the hill.
Pradeep, what's the...
Our numbers are probably smaller because in terms of trees, we probably have something like 25 or 26 species of lithophytic trees that belong to the desert and that survive. sustainably without any help at all. There's probably another 30 odd woody shrubs, but there's a lot of little things. And for us, what became very, very interesting and important was grasses. We worked out that there was something like 74 species of grasses that grow in desert rock in that part of the world. We've got something like 65 or 66 species growing in there now. And it's an experiment because we don't know how these grasses interact with each other, whether some of them are dominant, some of them will push other ones out and supplant them, whether they will live in harmony. This is all an experiment. So we take, we try and observe what's happening and try and learn from what we see. But it's been very, very interesting, and it makes such a huge difference, not just in terms of soil holding and all of that, but just visually, the grasses lend such a beautiful aspect, even when they're drying and golden, and all the seeds and flowers have dropped off. Absolutely gorgeous.
So one of the things that ecologists or ecological gardeners think have to work with is actually the different types of life forms that you have in your ecosystem. So, you have the grasses, a perennial grass, and then you might have annual grasses. And you'd have to work with them very differently. Then you'd have little herbaceous annuals, shrubby perennials, succulents, obviously lianas and trees. In our case, we have epiphytes, for instance, or tubers, large plants that have these large underground perennating organs. So could you give us a sense of that, sense of the different types of life forms that you're working with and how you would work with them?
So maybe I could, I was just thinking before you asked that, Supi, about a different question at this point. If we're talking and people are watching and thinking about rewilding, and is the question of, there's a question of scale, I think, in terms of on what is the, on large areas of land, what are the tweaks, or what are the things that we have to offer that have the biggest impact on the landscape scale health of, I'll say forest for us, but it's not always forest. It could, could be a wetland somewhere, it could be, Pradip's case, the desert. And then those gardening techniques that we use to engage with understanding finer details. And then there's the which we haven't touched on yet, is maybe the difference when we are growing things in a place where we know there's going to be a human engagement, and we're talking about sharing a landscape with the public and introducing people to plants, and the difference between that and saying, okay, well, here's a whole hillside or a series of hillsides. We have friends working on even bigger scales, don't we, in different places. So I find that maybe an interesting thing to get into from a practical perspective also, if people are looking at rewilding. There's interesting questions there on defining what it is that you're doing also.
Sure. Pradip, what do you think? It's a huge question, Govinda. So I think you'd have to find a way to the complex things that you've just asked yourself, because scale is major. If you're working with 50 acres or 60 acres, as we are at Gurukula, or the community in the riverside, or like Pradip, it's a place that millions of people visit, or the reserve forest. I don't know how we can attend to that in this conversation, but go for it.
There's one thing I want to say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to throw it at you anyway.
There's one thing I wanted to say, and that is that, you know, I'm aware that I'm talking as though there's been this great success with doing Jodha Park, but I've had a lot of failure. I have a lot of projects that I've started and not been able to go on with. And I've learned a lot of lessons from some of these failures. The failures have not been because one was unable to grow plants or, you know, restore the land, but the failures almost always had to do with the nature of the person who owns the land and their commitment to supporting rewilding. Very, very crucial. And the advice I give to young people that I meet who, you know, who sometimes ask me questions is, look, you know, make bloody sure that, you know, it's no good if you are persuading somebody to rewild their land if they're not totally convinced, you know, because you're going to come to grief at some point, right? I've tried to work twice in the lower Himalaya where I had this idea that if we could find a village community that had an interesting what's called a pagdandi, you know, a pathway winding through very interesting mountain scenery, we could rewild simply 30 feet on each side without taking land away from pasture or from agriculture or from anything else, and create the illusion that people who are walking through it are experiencing the full diversity of plants that you see at that height, at altitude in the mountains. And I thought it was a wonderful idea because the plan was to get the village community to then earn by selling tickets to people who would then, you know, do that. And each time I was working with you know, I needed an NGO in place. But whether it's an NGO or whether it's an individual landowner or whether it's a school or an institution, one piece of advice I have to people is make sure that they are fully and properly on board. Because my experience with Jodha Park was that I just have unlimited praise for how wonderfully I was backed up by the Meranga Museum Trust once they were convinced that this was the way to go. I mean, they sometimes said no to things that I proposed, but they always had reasons, good reasons to say no. But the support and the you know, their willingness to go all the way to do the stuff we've done, it's just been absolutely amazing. And I couldn't have done it without their support. And I'm not just saying this to, you know, because somebody's watching, but I just find that there's so many instances with other people, with other friends, you know, who have spent 2, 3, 4, 5 years doing things, and then it's all unraveled because suddenly the people who own the land say, no, this is no good, and we're not earning anything from it or whatever, you know. Do you have anything to say about that, Govinda?
Well, we have worked almost exclusively on public land. Which brings a lot of challenges of its own. But the beauty of it is that whatever we are able to do is legally protected. So whether we are allowed to continue for all eternity or not is beside the point, because if it's reserve forest, then the trees are actually legally protected. So that's an interesting thing. Now, recently we we've kind of been feeling that actually the forest has reached that critical point where it's looking after itself, in terms of the hill, which we've been, you know, it needs protection for however long it takes. But in terms of planting, it will return to forest with or without planting. So we've started going into village water bodies recently. So the plains, Tamilnadu, you have a lot of these large crescent earthen dams which date back some few centuries, which would catch monsoon streams, and then they have a often few hundred acres of what is either common grazing land or is a lake for a few months, which is then released to get a second rice crop. And so there's actually lots of, and every village has a they're called yeris. Every village has a lake or two and lots of land. And this is also being promoted right now for kind of regeneration. So entering into a new dialogue with the villages and what they would like as a forest on the edge, and what protection they are interested in, and versus, you know, grazing versus too soon to say how that pans out. But we're also working in villages where also many people from the village have worked with us on reforesting the hill for many years. So there's already that sense of a buy-in to the whole notion of bringing the forest back. So it's a very different equation for us, actually, in that way.
There's a question, Govinda, which connects to you, what you're saying, which, you know, does rewilding always mean excluding local people's needs, relationships with their environment? So maybe that's something, you know, you've just started to touch upon that, if you want to say something about it.
Does it always mean, I absolutely hope not. I absolutely hope not.
So for instance, is the hill used by the local community? That's a second question. Is it used by the local community?
So again, you know, we are not in charge of policy. We are engaging in a complex human landscape, and we are bringing our own inputs, but we are not, you know, it's not up to us which direction the forest department takes, for example. Is the hill used in terms of, if you remember that photo at the beginning, the urban population compared to the area of forest, we're not talking about a local population which is largely dependent on the forest anymore. There will still be a few grazers, maybe some wood collection, but it's as a major factor in the town. But then when we move out to the villages, of course, you know, those grazing lands are important. And so when we're looking at these lakes, we're talking about a few acres that we're saying, can we set aside, you know, 4 acres of a 100, 200 acre lake bed for a few years, until, you know, trees clear goat height. And I think people seem to be very happy about that as an idea. How it will play out, it's too early for us to say at this point. And in terms of, you know, use is a strange word anyway. I mean, but in terms of appreciation for change in character of the hill, and seeing it become greener year on year, and the idea of what it is, what it could be, seems to be very welcome in terms of, I haven't heard people unhappy about a forest returning. But as I say, you know, it's not in our control who has access, who has use, who.
Right, Pradeep.
Yeah.
If you were to envisage this in another place in Rajasthan, how would you actually go about it? Where would you go? How would you choose? What could be a next step?
Well, I've actually given up all the rewilding work that I do, Supi, which you probably know. I did do a project after this one. I shouldn't say after it, I was doing it while I was still doing this, which was creating a park inside the city of Jaipur. But you know, rather than that, I want to talk a little bit about, or rather I want to raise the issue of how important is it to do any of this work? Does it have any significance? Does it have any resonance at all? You know, and I'm going to lead off, Govinda, by saying that, you know, we are a very small community of people who, some of us hold hands, some of us don't even know each other. I could think of Vijay Dasmana in Delhi. I could think of two beautiful friends in Alibag in Bombay, Ritu Shastri and Nahid Karimji, who are rewilding their little private gardens in Alibag. There's Supi, of course, and her gang out at Gurukula. There's you, there's wonderful gang out at Auroville who seem to be doing lovely work. But I think if we put all of this work together, if we put all of these lands together, I'd be surprised if we totaled more than, you know, a few square kilometers of area. That's really, really very, very small, you know. So when it comes to significance, I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, are we going anywhere? You know, there are young people like Fazal Rashid and Somil Daga in Delhi who are starting up. There's obviously a lot of interest, but all the land that should be rewilded actually belongs to the Forest Department. And the Forest Department continues to be an old elephant that was, you know, raised in colonial days and still thinks and behaves like a colonial elephant, you know. I was shocked to hear the other day that, you know, India has committed to, they talk about restoring nearly 30 million hectares of forest land, of degraded forest land, according to one of these Bonn conventions. I was shocked to hear that India claims that they've nearly done 10 million acres already, 10 million hectares already. Where? With what? With what knowledge? With what plan? You know, is this complete eyewash? We are actually standing at, you know, the crossroads of a very, very difficult time, I think, in terms of our ecology and our environment in this country. The government has absolutely no sympathy for natural forests. You see, you know, the complete dismantling of the whole environmental protection system that has grown up over the last 20 years. So I think it's time to actually ask ourselves whether we need to go into a kind of adversarial role now and you know, and really become much more proactive in terms of, you know, fighting the government, given what's happening at this moment in time. Supi, do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think that's a question that Leo and Bhargavi would really like to take up. Leo, are you there? Bhargavi?
Yeah, probably Leo would like to take this. Leo, are you there? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, as Pradip was talking, I was just thinking, in one of the projects where we had to do an evaluation of all the environmental clearances, we found that the condition for the environmental clearance was plant trees. And the same condition was given to all kinds of industries everywhere. So from a biotech industry, which is inside a city, to a mining clearance, which has been given in a reserve forest, everybody just had to go plant trees. And there was no monitoring or evaluation of whether they really planted or not. That's a kind of attention the ministry is paying to restoration work, which is very, very disappointing. While this has been such a fascinating, and it gave me so much hope that, this kind of work is possible everywhere. That's why my question was, if any forest department anywhere has approached you people saying that, let's try this out here, it would be such a great start.
So the interesting thing is that the forest department is completely, it's completely shocking to me that in 14 years that we've been creating the Jodha Desert Rock Park in Jodhpur, I have not had one forester visit the park to say, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Not one, not one. Nobody from the Central Arid Zone Research Institute, because they feel they know more. Nobody from AFRI, which is the central government forest, Arid Zone Forest Research Institute. So we really operate completely outside the ambit of, official recognition or official interest, in what is going on. And that is what is so disappointing. On the other hand, let me just say this, that, we've just nearly completed a park in Jaipur with the Jaipur Development Authority, which is a government organization, who commissioned us to restore some sand dunes that had banked up against a hill inside Jodhpur, inside Jaipur city. And I give them credit for doing that, At the same time, they were completely mystified, They would, throughout the development stage of the project, they would scratch their heads and say, I don't have any idea what these guys are up to, It's nothing like what we know. It's nothing like the kind of work that we do. And they were puzzled, but they did support us and they did go through it, right?
I have a follow-up on that. See, Pradip, I think you raised a very, very valid concern when you said that despite all the efforts that at least the three of you and your groups have done in 3 different parts of India, very, very distinct parts of, from the biodiversity value, it's still only a few square kilometers or less. And we have the largest estate holder in the country, which is the forest department, which has absolutely no training or no effort at making, anyone aware of these amazing, efforts. And I think it's largely got to do with the fact that we are so steeped in the colonial system of understanding what forests are. And this is written down in law. It is written down in the Forest Act. It is written down in the Revenue Act. And this is what they're trained in. So unless we get in there and really shake them up and make them realize that they're just seeing the whole thing the wrong way. And then we have another problem, which we tackled about a year ago with this Jaggi Vasudev, and starting to start planting millions of trees across the Kaveri, without really any concern for the landscape, without any concern for ecology, and largely as a financial proposition. So I think you're right that we have to get proactive about both rewilding and also stopping the nonsense. That also requires a deeper understanding of what's happening with the forest department. They're so now, I mean, I don't know if you are aware, about 2 years ago, Dr. Harshvardhan, when he was the environment minister, he came up with the forest policy, a draft forest policy. There's a lot of concern now about the EIA notification, which is terrible. But if you read the draft forest policy, nothing of what you have said, of what all three of you have shared, is there in the text of it. So how did we go so wrong in this country? You know, we're just absolutely going the wrong way.
I completely agree with you. Supriya, I'm wondering whether we should go to questions now. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, well, actually, we have been fielding some. There's several on, I mean, there's several to do with the forest department, and there's several to do with education, actually, and outreach and getting younger people involved and so on. So maybe since both of you have actually done fairly extensive work on interpretation and with groups and so on, do you want to talk about that? Both education as well as outreach. I mean, they're two different things.
Govinda, you go.
The only thing I would add to the conversation which just happened, I mean, one is that we have managed, in our case, we have managed to work with the support of the forest department, which has been largely informal, but there has been appreciation. There has been a lot of respect for what we've managed to do, and it's largely been personal, but that has been a journey together. I think it is worth noting that on the local, I have no experience of policy level things, and but at the local level, that bridges can be built and a way can be found, I think is worth saying also. But the other thing that struck me is, well, two things. I remember a conversation that you and I had in your house in Delhi a long time back, Pradip, which was, you were talking about one of the acacias and saying, you know, isn't it strange that you never see it in the forest, this beautiful, beautiful tree. And then you said, and then it occurred to me that its natural habitat is deep alluvial soil, the farmland, right?
That's right.
And I showed you that Google Earth map of our landscape, and I described this agricultural plain with these inselbergs rising from it. Now, what we call the forest is these rocky outcrops, which are rising out of these flat areas with nice deep soils. And we forget that all of the forest was covering all these agricultural areas for countless millennia, and we don't get to see what those forests would look like. And we can also be attached to the idea of wilding what we consider wild lands. But we have a small community living on a farm with a school there, and we're surrounded by farmland. We're being encroached upon by the real estate business, and but the models of agriculture also leave so little room for the idea of wildness. The obsession with cleaning soils down, plowing soils even when you're not planting, with removing any little strips of weeds along your boundaries, with burning off whatever crop residues or weeds you've pulled out rather than letting them rot down. And our little 10-acre campus surrounded by farmland is a little haven. And it's not, nobody would call it a wilderness. It's alive. It's buzzing, it's throbbing with bird life and snakes crawling around and mongooses running around and hares in the bushes. And so that is something where a lot of people listening may well have access to. Yes, it's not landscape level change, but I think ignoring the agricultural landscape or the private landscape as a potential for creating space for the wild. Perhaps it's not rewilding in the way that we think about it, but creating cracks for the wild to come into these landscapes where people are doing everything they can to keep it out, is something worth also talking about.
I couldn't agree with you more, Govinda. I couldn't agree with you more. You know, one of the things I want to write about over the next few months is something that is addressed to the profession of landscape architect in this country, who, for some strange reason, have decided that their ideal landscape is the kind of landscape that you get in Sharjah and Dubai with palms and drip irrigation. You know, I don't know why this has happened, but this is the sad reality. But there is so much, even on the tiny scale that you're talking about, that people could do. I remember reading, there's a forester called R.N. Parker, who wrote a book about the flora of the Punjab, including Delhi, in the 1920s. And he said that, you know, whenever a Sikh farmer clears forest land, he always leaves a tiny patch of original forest. And he says they leave it for the birds and the bees, and they call it a rak. Now, if you know your Hindi at all, I don't know whether you know any Hindi at all.
I'm a Tamil speaker.
But you're a Tamil speaker. But rak means to keep or to conserve, you know.
Oh.
So it's a beautiful word. And the idea of a rak, the idea that you could actually conserve, even if it was very tokenistic, just a tiny little part of your original flora, because there were birds and bees and moths and creatures and millipedes that depended on it. It was just a wonderful idea, you know. And yeah, no, I agree completely. I think rewilding can happen at any scale. It needs to happen at a huge scale, but it definitely also needs to happen at very, very tiny scales, even in, you know, very, very.
And I think that also we jump to looking at the urgency and the depth of the need, and those small scale things just seem so insignificant. But it's also the shift in perception that can happen from those small scale things, which may make the larger scale changes which you were despairing about happening. You know, if everyone, you know, if everyone started to, you know, as you say, garden with natives, welcome bugs back into their gardens. You know, I was going to show you a picture earlier about the rewilding of our home, actually. Let me.
Please do show it. I'll show you a counter picture. I'll show you a counter picture.
There's lots of questions, folks. So,
right.
Govinda.
So this is our house in construction about 10 years ago.
Right.
And here it is today.
Wow.
And And
you know what?
the thing about it, okay, it's a cute picture, but I don't know if you noticed that it's a very porous situation, our house. So we share it with a good number of bats, a fair few frogs, a lot of toads, the occasional snake, the occasional scorpion, few fish in a little channel around our food cupboard, lots of shrews, lots of rats, and it's not what is, you know, it's not that habitat again is somehow significant on any global scale, but just the the shift in perception that this life is to be shared and this life is to be nurtured, and what may happen on a cultural level if people started making space for other life in their lives, I think is worth thinking about, at least.
I agree completely. Can I show two pictures as well?
Sure.
Share screen. This is a photograph of an old gateway into Jodhpur city that in 2011 was derelict completely up on the top left. And this is what happened when we planted entirely native, apart from the neem tree that you see on the left, we planted entirely native plants. And see, there's a very common perception that if you plant native plants, you don't get beauty, you don't get nice things. But this is just simply not true, you know. There's something I think that's even more important than than sharing your garden with frogs and toads and bats. And that is that, if you look at the rest of the world now, Southern California, for example, now has extremely strict water conservation rules that actually map transpiration rates of plants that are used in landscapes, where lawns are not allowed beyond 10% of the of a landscape, and where native plants are encouraged because they are completely at home in those biomes, right? And it's time we woke up to that. When you look around you in even in a city like Delhi, the central ridge is 850 hectares of invasive forest that is there only because people planted the wrong species. They couldn't understand that if you planted species that were actually at home in thin soil, rocky biomes, you'd get a brilliant, natural dry deciduous forest. Possibly the most beautiful dry deciduous forest the most beautiful forest that any city, any capital city in the world could have. But no, you've got a degraded, what I call a ratpati forest instead. So I think that that's a really important takeaway. But Subi, by all means, let's move to questions now. I need to excuse myself for 1 second.
Well, you've both excused yourselves. So maybe you're there, okay. Right. I just want to wrap up that section by saying that, I've had the question very much of, to broaden out the question of rewilding from the specific projects that, say, we have created and been part of. What else could rewilding look like? Could it look like a food forest, for instance? For instance, all over Kerala and the Western Ghats, you have these very diverse home gardens that are traditional, which are going the other way, becoming less and less diverse or more chemically intensive. It shouldn't take much more than a few economic incentives or changes in some practice to actually recover tremendous diversity and what I would call, or we would call, ecosystem properties to the landscape at a fairly large scale with a lot of people who are, cultivators. And then, could it look like just like natural succession, which is basically what we've seen at, around Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary? Could rewilding just look like natural succession? Could it look like tree planting? I have an Adivasi friend who, when their colony was, when their hamlet was relocated from to a grassland, they basically said, look, we are forest peoples, and they just planted up the whole area of about 10 acres on this assigned land. It's not really, it's a whole problem there. But they grew a forest of very diverse trees. Could it look like permaculture? Because that's a question that I'm often asked. Is permaculture a solution to things? Could permaculture be something that is, within the framework of, or the broad definition of rewilding? What about agroforestry? Wangari Maathai has reforested huge areas of land and saying that people can, live from this area that was degraded and brought back to some measure of tree cover. So, I spent a year at the Land Institute in Kansas where they were talking about farming in nature's image. So taking the monoculture of the prairie, of the wheat, huge wheat areas, to the perennial polycultures of the prairies by actually introducing perennial grasses, which we could eat from, composites and so on. So taking something that's an annual monoculture that's chemically intensive to a perennial polyculture that sustains and builds soil over time are models of, I would say, rewilding coming from different angles. Could it look like ecosystem gardening, which is what we're all talking about? So at Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary, we're working with mosses and ferns and orchids and, bringing back all kinds of rare plants. So for me, it's a very wide and broad definition, which looks at soil, which looks at diversification, which looks at people living there. If bison start walking around and have been walking around already in Kodaikanal town, is that a form of rewilding, when we bring animals back? So I think, we have explored specific, versions of it in our particular projects. But there are many, many different experiments which clearly show that the earth can be nurtured in very different ways, depending on who you are and where you are. And it's almost like an individual person, each place. So I'd like to encourage that, actually, that this is a diverse approach with many talents and sensibilities and cultural practices involved. In our case, the traditional home garden of Kerala would very much be part of a rewilding process of the whole landscape. And I'd like to encourage that. And it is being encouraged by Sunita Rao and Shirsi, many, many people who are looking at food forests and, multi-tiered coffee and jackfruit and so on, instead of the tea or the bitter gourd, and very, very intensive practices. So I'm not sure, this is now like 10:15. Are you guys game for more? Leo, do we have more time? Because there's still more questions, and so long as Govinda and Pradip are game, I think, and there's still lots of people hanging on. There's more than 100 people still here.
I think let's go to questions so that we're also dealing with what things that people are interested in.
Well, education was a big one, so we haven't gone there. Sorry, Leo.
Go ahead, Suprabha, finish. Yeah, finish.
Well, education was a big one.
True. I was just flagging a very small technical problem, and that is because this is a great conversation and I wanted to go on. We are at the back end trying to download the file so that you have more space, because we're recording it as well. So just highlighting that could be a problem we should keep our, pay attention to as we go forward. Yeah?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
So by education, are you talking about interpretation, or do you mean educating people about rewilding as a practice?
Well, there's how do we pass it on to the next generation? How do we reach more people? How do we create a new culture? I think these are the questions.
I think we need to have some webinars. No, I mean, what else? You know, there is a huge amount of to be gained by demonstrating the value of doing some rewilding. So I'm sure that people who visit you, Supi, in Gurukula, or people who visit Govinda, or people who visit Jodha Park, come away with a very new set of, you know, perception about what is possible and what is not, you know. I think very often these perceptions need to be guided a little bit. And that's why we use naturalist guides who've been very carefully trained. And it's something we intend to do in Jaipur as well, where we have a much more intensively interpreted landscape, where we've actually gone to the trouble of, you know, collecting 20 different kinds of rocks that are essentially made of silica, and we explain, leading in Hindi but also in English, what, you know, what everything's about. So I think these things help, but I definitely feel that, you know, rewilding needs to find a podium from which it speaks, from which people can learn, that people can ask questions from, maybe, you know, maybe a little brain trust of some kind. And there are wonderful people, you know, all over the country, some of whom I've only heard of, I've not even met. And I want to reiterate an offer that I made before, which is that I'd love to actually hold a rewilding conference in Jodhpur, where I know that the Museum Trust will go out of its way to help at some point in the future, where, you know, maybe 10 or 20 of us can sit down and chuck ideas around and perhaps end up with a little manual which tells people for different kinds of biomes what they can do.
Govinda?
Yeah, difficult questions. You know, colleagues, friends of mine who run the school where I live, the Marudan school, would have a lot to say on this question. So, you know, as a community, we have been involved in running a school. So we have the experience of children who are with us day in, day out over years. And then we also have public space where we have local school children come for perhaps a couple of hours, and then we may not see them again. So this, you know, this two kind of, and I think, you know, you have similar ranges of experience. The former, the having a school where there is space for in-depth cultural, you know, it's culture work actually to on an ongoing basis be with the land, and in our school that takes the form of gardening, growing food, being in touch with where the food comes from. Not that the children grow all the food by any stretch, but that it's part of the awareness of the school where the food is coming from. Spending time outside, spending time valuing their bodies and the experience of being embodied, and spending time in the forest, which is a weekly affair for every child in school. Comparing that to what one is trying to impart when a child comes from a government school or a visiting private school, then for a, you know, at most a half-day visit. When you say, Pradip, that, you know, we need a podium, and I mean, we're talking about deep cultural shifts, and we know what messages are being given, you know, from TV and from the, you know, from the gadgets, and how much we can really do in that time is an open question. But it's been important for us to, so the other thing that I haven't mentioned that we have been involved in from the beginning is, apart from the rewilding work, is just creation of public space. So we have been involved in regenerating areas of space in and around the town that we have used native plants, we've done water saving, but that's not been a big statement. The point has been providing access to the outdoors for largely children, but actually it turns out that everyone wants it and everybody needs it. So we created the first big playground in the town, and now it's, you know, it has water bodies, it has trees, and has play equipment made out of recycled junk, and in, you know, pre-pandemic, there were, you know, on a normal Sunday there would be hundreds, thousands of families coming to enjoy the space. And just access to outside, how it's taken, what seeds it sows, I don't know actually, but it is getting harder and harder to come by, and it's getting, and so providing that has been another important thing for us, and it's something that we're actually starting a new project, regenerating a water body in town, which will be another public space, which again, it's not for us to set the agenda, but we are just providing places that people can just go and be outside. And I think that there isn't enough of it. There isn't enough place where people can just be in the open air, looking at plants, looking at water, feeling the breeze on their face. Because I'm personally skeptical about how much you can change in a class, you know, we need to do interpretation, we need to tell the stories of what we've done. I completely agree with Pradip that seeing it happen is the real important thing, you know, seeing the change in the landscape. But yeah, education, I so many questions there.
Okay, here's a question that's going to be a good one for Pradip. What about Miyawaki forests? That's quite a range in places, and can we look at a parallel approach to increase the green cover with example like urban forests, microforests, Miyawaki forests?
Okay, I'll try and tell you what I know about Miyawaki forest, which is not a lot. Obviously, I've seen Shubhendu Sharma's TED talk, and I've heard people talk about it. And my understanding of, you know, I've seen a few Miyawaki patches. My understanding is that they are extremely extensive. They plant
expensive or extensive?
Extensive, with a T.
Mm.
They tend to work the soil very carefully. They plant 2 feet apart, so they create dense woodland. They pay lip service to native species, but some friends of mine have sent me lists of species that they planted, and they don't seem to be particularly native. And they tend to be mostly trees and lianas. They are competing for light, and therefore they grow very quickly and very tall, and they grow quickly also because the soil is being worked very, very well, and there's a lot of nutrients in there. But I'm not sure that a Miyawaki forest looks like anything that we know in nature here. I can see that in a Japanese context where it might have been first tried, where you have coniferous forests that actually do grow, where the trees do grow actually very close to each other. It might have a very different resonance. You know, for me, the jury is out. I think Miyawaki forests are great for little factories that have tiny, you know, yards at the back that they want to green. They're fine for them. I don't think they equate at all with rewilding, not in the least, right? And they don't, to my eye, whenever I've seen a picture of a rewilded, of a Miyawaki forest landscape, I'm not being particularly moved or impressed. But maybe Govinda knows a little more than I do about that.
No, I know even less, really. I've not seen a single, so I'm completely unqualified to say anything. You know, I know that I would. No, I'm actually literally unqualified to say anything on the subject.
So my understanding is simply this: they're expensive, they're extremely water intensive, and they don't look nice. Now, I wouldn't, for those reasons, I wouldn't want to grow a Miyawaki forest. But I'm sure that there are people who own factory yards who say, well, you know, here's a solution for growing a whole lot of stuff in the tennis court sized yard that I have behind my factory. That's fair enough.
Yeah, I guess the concern that I have is there's a lot of, you know, let's do this quickly because we found the solution to do it and this is how you do it and it works there. So and the sense of a formulaic approach is something I'm extremely skeptical of, that it applies everywhere and, you know, we get quick results and somehow the attention that both of you have, you know, just communicated about the work that you do, and I certainly know of all my companion people at Gurukula Botanical Science, it's slow work, even though there's great urgency at the global scale of, you know, climate change and so on. The actual process of rewilding, you know, is an attentive process.
Yeah. You know, in Delhi, there is a sort of city government sponsored, somebody needs to put their mic off, Gautami ji. The DDA, the Delhi Development Authority in Delhi, works with a very well-known botanist called Dr. C.R. Babu, who does all the botanical work that they do in terms of creating city forests and biodiversity forests. And one of the things we've noticed is that these forests don't, you know, even though Dr. Babu is probably a very knowledgeable man, and he knows exactly what native species are, and he claims to be creating native species forests, native plant forests. If you actually visit one of his places, for one, these are dense woodlands that don't have any resemblance to anything that you would see in these kinds of biomes in a Delhi-like situation. Probably because, you know, they grow all these plants, they're given to a gardener, and they're told, you know, here are these 3,000 plants, go and plant them. So they're all stuck in the ground like that. If you go to the bottom of some of these old mining pits where he's done some work, you find that he's got these sprinklers and misting units where he's growing orchids that don't belong to Delhi at all, and ferns, some of which are Delhi species, but lots of them are not. So he's obviously ashamed too of the, you know, he seems to think that it's not enough to grow something native, you need to bring in other things that are like attraction. So there's a terrible perversion that's happening at that municipal gardening level. And then what is, to my mind, even worse is that when they do their interpretation, when they do their interpretation centers, they're ghastly. awful. They're didactic, they're talking down to kids, they're not interesting, they're not well written, they're not engaging. So, we have some terrible examples of official rewilding in Delhi today. And I just want to draw attention to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments that have come in on the Miyawaki thing, but I think the purpose here in this meeting is not really to discuss another system, but to kind of impart some of the lessons and experiences that Govinda and Pradip have had through their long projects in 2 specific locations. And it's not really to compare and contrast this with some other magical solution, but really, again, I'm just struck by the quality of attention and detail of work at, large to small to tiny. So I was just wondering, Govinda mentioned fire and preventing fire and grazing. In our case, there's also rewilding that can happen by blocking toxins, like pulling toxins off the river, and the return of fish, and then the whole process of the fish impact crabs or other water animals, and the vegetation on the side, the fertility of the water, the nutrient load, all that. And so a lot of what we may need to do might be to desist, resist, block, stop, kind of things, and then this very careful work. And when I shared the announcement for the webinar on the Western Guard Google group, one comment that came back was, but this is great, but what about all the stuff that we have to do to stop the criminal actions that are happening to old growth forests or wild places? So I just want to say that I don't think any of us in the business of rewilding, for those of us for whom rewilding is a calling, it's not in place of, the first challenge has to be to stop habitat from being destroyed, to stop communities from being removed from habitats, And this is something also that we have to do anyway, because so much land is degraded and the consequences of that are enormous. There are literally enormous implications at a planetary scale. So this work has to happen alongside with the protection of biomes wherever they are and the people who depend on them. Well, Leo, Bhargavi, anything that you would like to ask? I think I've covered the general questions that have been asked. There's I think if people have detailed things, they should just write to you now. And all our places are open to, conversation and questions and visiting. You can write to us. So maybe I'd like to just give it over to Leo if you want to ask something at this point.
I think this has been one of the most amazing conversations to be part of. And I also want to draw everyone's attention to a post I just made on the chat box. On the back, in the background, Sana, Ashwin, Sneha, and Karthik have been pulling together quotes from this conversation. And I just think we crossed 105 tweets. So if you click on the Twitter link, you will actually get a report of this conversation, at least the highlights. And I would encourage everyone to reshare it, because I think this conversation needs to be heard again and again, and by multiple people across anywhere, really. So that's one amazing resource we already have here. Apart from that, I don't know. There's so much to digest, so much that you both have shared, all three of you actually. And each of you comes, just one Eastern Ghats, one Western Ghats, one desert ecosystem. Come on. What more can one ask? And Pradip has also worked in the Himalayan terrain. I was just thinking coastal ecosystem was left out. But we'll get there.
The Northeast is also left out. The
Northeast is also left out. Exactly, yeah. But but this is the kind of conversation which I think we should. I'm actually going to trouble a lot of forest officials to listen to this video. We're going to put it up on our website. We are also it's already available anyway on Facebook. So I encourage everyone who's participated to share it, particularly with those who are in key decision-making roles in defining how landscape transformations take place. And why shouldn't they allow rewilding with some nurturing, so that that becomes the mode rather than what we now have monocultures by and large.
Thank you, Leo, for organizing this, and
thank you both.
Supi,
really.
for
Suprabha is the one who was the person who pulled it all together. I think all credit goes to her.
absolutely. Supi is a mover and shaker.
Govinda, you still have to take me up that hill.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank everyone for really participating so enthusiastically, and it was a very, very disciplined participation. Very difficult on a platform like this. I do like the fact that somebody was trying to get their kids to eat, and we are part of that. But that's what Zoom does to us. But I think everyone did a great job. Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
Okay,
thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah. Oh, one more thing. I just want to say that just one more thing. We are actually going to archive all of this, and a lot of questions that have come. If all three of you don't mind, if you can create a small discussion group, and then those questions can be addressed, if that's possible. Yeah. So
Sure.
that's one other way of taking the conversation forward. And if you go to esgindia.org, there are two excellent webinars tomorrow. One is on the terrible environment impact assessment notification. But what's beyond that? That's the conversation tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the morning. And in the evening at 4 o'clock, if those of you are interested in urban mobility, there's another conversation happening. Details are on esgindia.org. Yeah. Thank you all.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you and good night.
Bye.